What I wanted to talk about very briefly before moving on to kind of a summation of the significance of this slave trade that I'm talking about. Slave trade, the significance to both Europe and to Africa. Before I do that, I want to talk very briefly about the mortality of this Middle Passage. Again, it is with extreme difficulty that we estimate the number of people who died in the course of the Middle Passage. One reason that it's difficult, as I said, is because it's difficult to know fully how many Africans actually were taken across the Atlantic. And second, it's difficult to know because the records that we have are far from complete. The whole areas, the smuggled Africans who undoubtedly lived in worse conditions during this Middle Passage. We have no sense of the numbers lost in those voyages. What records we do have suggest a great variability in the number of Africans who died in the course of the Middle Passage. In the late 1680s, while the Royal Africa Company, the royal monopoly in England, was the exclusive carrier of slaves for England, English vessels lost about 1 out of every 4 Africans aboard these vessels. Later, at the height of in the early 18th century, when the British had become the preeminent slave traders in the world, the losses dropped to the extent of about 1 in 10. But again, as I said, there's great variability. In the year 1788, the British abolitionist, the advocate of the abolition of the slave trade, a man named William Wilberforce, estimated that the mortality rate on these vessels was about 12.5%, 1 in 8. In 1792, the British Parliament conducted a survey suggesting that the number of Africans dying in this Middle Passage stood at about 17%. About 1 out of every 6 Africans aboard these vessels died. So let's just take the most conservative 10 or 12% as being representative of 400 years of slave trade, encompassing a smallest estimate of about 11 million people transported. And what we get, if we're using the figure of 10%, is over 1 million human beings perished in this Middle Passage. And again, the key thing that I want to emphasize here is that this is the minimal figure, and probably what we're looking at is several times that number when we take all the information into account. Again, as I said earlier, one of the what's completely left out of that equation, if we want to talk about the impact of the slave trade on Africans, the number of Africans who die in this slave trade, what's left completely out of the mortality rate of the Middle Passage is that most of the slaves were taken from inland tribes. The inland tribes did not have a relationship to the Europeans. The tribes that were on the coast had the relationship, the trading relationship with the Europeans, and they raided inland to capture people that would then be brought to the coast. And they were brought to the coast in what were called slave coffles. And a British explorer David Livingstone, missionary and explorer named David Livingstone, estimated that for every slave that completed the journey to the coast, 10 died on the way. Now, this is very late in the slave trade, after the abolition, the British abolition of the slave trade, and Livingstone is here condemning the Arab slave trade, but we can, I think, say with some degree of assurance that under the British, when the British ruled the roost in terms of the slave trade, a considerable number of people died in the transportation of slaves from inland to the coastal areas. If it was not 9 out of every 10 who died, it might well have been 4 out of every 5 or 3 out of every 5 who died. So this completes my discussion of the Middle Passage. I want to, in my next, talk to you about the significance of this slave trade, both to Europe and to Africa. And really, Africa is deeply impacted by the slave trade, and that's what we'll talk about next.